Chapter 1. The Discovery. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows of Greyminster when Tom Fletcher arrived at what the villagers had always called Orchard House, though precious little remained to justify either part of its name. The house itself had been reduced to foundation stones and scattered brick over the past fortnight, and the orchard that had once stretched behind it now consisted of 3 gnarled apple trees standing like ancient sentinels over weedy ground. Tom spat on his hands and gripped the handle of his spade with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 20 years moving earth for other people's purposes. The demolition contract was simple enough. Clear the site completely, foundations and all, so that Mrs. Pemberton from the next village could build her modern bungalow. It was honest work, and Tom Fletcher had never been one to question the wisdom of replacing the old with the new. "Right then, lads," he called to his 2 assistants, young men from the village who were grateful for any employment that paid regular wages. "Let's have this cellar. Mind the beam across the entrance. It's been holding up nothing but air for 30 years, but it'll still break your skull if it takes a notion to fall." The cellar entrance had been discovered only the previous afternoon, hidden beneath a collapsed section of kitchen flooring. Tom had peered down into the darkness with his electric torch and seen nothing more alarming than stone walls and what appeared to be a dirt floor some 8 feet below. Still, something about the space had given him pause. Perhaps it was simply the way his torch beams seemed to be swallowed by the shadows, or the peculiar staleness of the air that rose from below. By 10 o'clock, Tom and his crew had rigged a proper ladder and begun the systematic excavation of the cellar floor. The earth came away easily enough, black loam mixed with fragments of pottery and the occasional rusted nail. Tom worked steadily, his mind occupied with calculations of how many more days the job would require and whether Mrs. Pemberton might be persuaded to authorize the removal of those stubborn apple trees. It was young Billy Hartwell who first struck something that wasn't earth or pottery. "Mr. Fletcher," Billy called, his voice carrying an odd note that made Tom look up from his own section of floor. "There's something here that don't feel right." Tom made his way across the uneven floor to where Billy stood, a spade held uncertainly in his hands. "What sort of something?" "Well, it's hard, but not like stone, and it's—" Billy swallowed hard. "It's the right shape to be a bone, Mr. Fletcher, a big one." Tom took the spade and scraped carefully at the earth around Billy's discovery. Within moments, he had exposed what was unmistakably a human rib cage, yellowed with age but still intact. His hands, steady enough when dealing with ordinary foundations and drainage pipes, began to tremble slightly as he brushed away more soil. "Dear God," he whispered. The skeleton lay on its back, arms crossed over the chest, in an attitude that suggested careful placement rather than hasty burial. But it was the clothing that made Tom Fletcher sit back on his heels and wipe his forehead with a suddenly unsteady hand. Clinging to the bones in tatters and patches were the unmistakable remains of white fabric, silk by the look of it, and cut in the style of a woman's dress. A wedding dress, unless Tom Fletcher was very much mistaken. "Billy," he said quietly, never taking his eyes from the skeleton, "you run along to the village and fetch P.C. Wilkins. Tell him to come at once and tell him to telephone to the county police from Mrs. Carmichael's post office. Tell them—" Tom paused, searching for words adequate to the situation. "Tell them we've found something that's been waiting a very long time to be discovered." As Billy scrambled up the ladder and his footsteps faded across the rubble above, Tom Fletcher found himself alone with his grim discovery. He had uncovered many things in his years of digging: Roman coins, medieval pottery, the stone foundations of buildings that had vanished from memory. But nothing had ever made him feel quite so much like an intruder, as though he had stumbled into a story that was not yet finished telling itself. The skeleton seemed to gaze up at him through empty sockets, and Tom noticed with growing unease that something white was caught between the ribs, a fragment of paper perhaps, or cloth different from the dress. He made no move to disturb it further. Some instinct, born perhaps of too many years spent uncovering the buried past, told him that this discovery would require more delicate handling than his rough spade could provide. Above him he could hear the sound of running feet and voices calling across the village green. Soon enough there would be officials and questions, and all the complicated business that followed when the dead refused to stay quietly buried. Tom Fletcher settled himself on an upturned crate to wait, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the pathetic remnants of what had once been someone's most important day. The morning mist had lifted completely now, and shafts of sunlight fell through the cellar entrance to illuminate the skeleton in stark, pitiless detail. In the distance, Tom could hear the church bells of Greyminster striking 11 o'clock, marking another hour in a day that had already become unlike any other in the village's quiet history. Chapter 2. Superintendent Battle arrives. The 2:47 train from London discharged only 2 passengers at Greyminster Halt, a modest platform that served the village and surrounding farms with the grudging efficiency typical of branch railway lines. The first passenger was Mrs. Headley, returning from a visit to her sister in Cheltenham, with a basket of preserves in the latest London fashions catalogue. The second was a large, solid man in a mackintosh who carried a small leather suitcase and moved with the unhurried deliberation of someone accustomed to arriving precisely when and where he intended. Superintendent Battle surveyed the modest platform and the single track that disappeared around a bend marked by hawthorn hedges. The air carried the clean scent of recent rain and something else, the indefinable atmosphere of a small community that had recently been disturbed from its routine. He had encountered this particular quality many times before, though he would have been hard-pressed to explain exactly how one sensed such things. Inspector Leach emerged from the single railway carriage with considerably less composure, consulting his watch and glancing about with the barely concealed impatience of a man who preferred the purposeful bustle of London to the apparent inactivity of rural England. "Quiet sort of place," Leach observed, falling into step beside Battle as they made their way toward the village proper. "Hard to imagine anything very dramatic happening here." "That," said Battle mildly, "would depend rather on what you consider dramatic." "The walk from the said Battle mildly, "would depend rather on what you consider dramatic." The walk from the station to the village centre took them past neat cottages with well-tended gardens, a Norman church surrounded by weathered headstones, and the inevitable village green where a duck pond reflected the grey autumn sky. Battle noted details with the automatic precision of long practice. The quality of the housing, the presence of electric lighting in most windows, the general air of modest prosperity that marked this as a community that had weathered recent changes reasonably well. P.C. Wilkins met them at the post office, a nervous young man who had clearly been rehearsing his report since receiving word of their arrival. He led them through the village with the earnest efficiency of someone determined to demonstrate his competence to his metropolitan colleagues. "The remains were discovered yesterday morning at approximately 10:30, Wilkins began, consulting his notebook with perhaps unnecessary frequency. "I secured the scene immediately and contacted the county police, as per regulations. Dr. Henley, he's our local physician, examined the remains and confirmed that we were dealing with human bones of considerable age." Battle listened without interruption as they walked, but his attention was equally divided between Wilkins's account and his own observations of their route. The demolished house sat at the village's eastern edge, where the organized domesticity of Greyminster gave way to fields and woodland. Someone had taken care to preserve the mature trees along this lane, and Battle noted with interest that several of the larger houses commanded clear views of what had once been Orchard House. The excavation site presented itself as a study in organized disruption. The demolition crew had rigged canvas sheeting to protect the cellar from weather, and their equipment stood neatly arranged at a respectful distance from the discovery. Tom Fletcher waited beside a wheelbarrow, his cap in his hands and his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had encountered something well outside his usual experience. Battle descended into the cellar with the careful attention he brought to all crime scenes, though this particular scene had been undisturbed for decades rather than hours. The skeleton lay exactly as Tom Fletcher had described. On its back, arms crossed, surrounded by the pathetic remnants of what had clearly been an elaborate dress. But it was the small details that captured Battle's interest. The way the bones were positioned with obvious care, the fragment of paper caught between the ribs, and something else that the others had apparently missed. "Interesting," he murmured, crouching beside the skull. "What's that, sir?" Leach asked, positioning himself for a better view. Battle pointed with his pencil to a small depression in the temporal bone. Someone took considerable trouble with the burial, but they weren't quite careful enough about the cause of death. He spent another quarter-hour in methodical examination, taking notes in his precise handwriting and asking Tom Fletcher to repeat his account of the discovery with particular attention to the exact position of every bone and fabric fragment. When he finally emerged from the cellar, Battle found that word of the Scotland Yard officer's arrival had drawn a small collection of villagers to the edges of the site. Dr. Henley proved to be a spare man in his 60s, with the brisk manner of someone accustomed to dealing with emergencies. He had examined the remains with professional thoroughness and was prepared to discuss his findings with the calm precision that Battle appreciated in medical men. "The skeleton is that of a young woman, I should say, between 20 and 30 years of age," Dr. Henley reported. "The bones show no signs of disease, and the dental work, what remains of it, suggests someone from a comfortable background. The fabric appears to be silk, and there are traces of what might have been lace trim." "How long buried, would you estimate?" "Difficult to say with precision, but certainly decades rather than years. The condition of the fabric and the degree of soil penetration suggest perhaps 20 to 30 years, possibly longer." Battle nodded thoughtfully. These estimates would place the burial somewhere in the 1890s, a time frame that would require considerable investigation into local records and family histories. He made arrangements for the remains to be properly photographed and removed for more thorough examination, then turned his attention to establishing his temporary headquarters. The Red Lion Inn occupied a prime position facing the village green, its Tudor facade and diamond-paned windows speaking of centuries of hospitality to travellers. Mrs. Thorne, the proprietress, received Battle and Leach with the mixture of curiosity and efficiency that marked experienced innkeepers. She provided them with adjoining rooms on the first floor, and assured them that the inn's dining room could accommodate their needs for meals and informal meetings. Battle settled into his room with the satisfaction of a man who appreciated simple comforts and practical arrangements. From his window he commanded an excellent view of the village green and the comings and goings of the local residents. Before unpacking his suitcase, he spent several minutes at the window, watching the patterns of village life with the patient attention that had served him well throughout his career. The discovery at Orchard House had certainly disturbed the routine of Greyminster, but Battle could already sense something more complex beneath the surface curiosity. Several times he observed residents pause in their conversations to glance toward the inn, and more than once he noticed curtains twitch in windows facing the excavation site. Whatever secrets lay buried with the skeleton in the wedding dress, Battle suspected they were not entirely confined to the past. Chapter 3. The Montford Legacy. Montford Manor stood at the end of a tree-lined drive that spoke of both prosperity and careful maintenance. The house itself dated from the Georgian period, its symmetrical facade of honey-coloured stone suggesting the wealth and position of the family that had commissioned it. Battle observed that the grounds were well kept, without being ostentatious, the sort of understated elegance that came from generations of secure income rather than recent acquisition. Inspector Leach straightened his tie as they approached the front entrance. Impressive place. These old county families usually have interesting stories to tell. Indeed, Battle replied, noting the way the afternoon light fell across the diamond-paned windows and revealed movement within. The question is which stories they choose to tell. The door was answered by a middle-aged woman, whose black dress and efficient manner identified her as the housekeeper. She received Battle's card with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to managing the social requirements of a household that still maintained proper standards. "Superintendent Battle to see Colonel Montford," Battle said. "I believe he is expecting us." They were shown into a morning room that overlooked the gardens toward the village. The furnishings reflected generations of accumulated comfort. Well-worn leather chairs, family portraits in heavy frames, and the sort of small, personal objects that spoke of lives lived within these walls rather than mere decoration. Battle positioned himself near the window where he could observe both the occupants of the room and the view toward the excavation site. Colonel Edmund Montford entered with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, though Battle noted the slight stiffness in his left leg that suggested an old military injury. He was perhaps 60 years of age, with greying hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. His handshake was firm, his manner outdoors. His handshake was firm, his manner cordial but reserved. "Superintendent Battle, Inspector Leach, I understand you're investigating the rather unfortunate discovery at the old house. Terrible business, of course, but I'm not certain how we might be of assistance." "Perhaps you could tell us something about the history of the property," Battle suggested. "I understand it belonged to your family." "Indeed, my late Uncle Tobias owned Orchard House until his death, or rather his disappearance. The matter was never entirely resolved." Colonel Montford's tone remained carefully neutral, but Battle detected the slight tension that accompanied discussions of family embarrassments. They were joined by Mrs. Vivian Montford, a handsome woman whose blonde hair and carefully maintained appearance suggested attention to current fashions despite her country setting. She acknowledged the introductions with cool politeness, settling herself in a chair positioned slightly apart from her husband. "How distressing this must be for the village," she observed, though her tone suggested more irritation than distress. "One hardly expects such discoveries in a place like Greyminster. I do hope the matter can be resolved quickly and with minimal disruption." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the younger members of the family. Rosalind Montford proved to be a striking young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded Battle of someone, though he could not immediately place the resemblance. Her brother Peter followed, a pleasant-faced young man who bore a strong likeness to his father, but with an easier manner that suggested less burden of responsibility. "We heard voices," Rosalind said, settling into a chair near Battle, with the natural grace of someone comfortable in her surroundings. "Peter and I have been wondering about the discovery ever since we heard. How extraordinary that someone should have been buried there all this time." "You find it extraordinary rather than distressing?" Battle asked mildly. "Both, I suppose. But one can't help being curious about such things. Who was she? How did she come to be buried there? It's rather like something from a novel." Peter nodded agreement, though his manner suggested less enthusiasm for the romantic aspects of the discovery. Still, it's rather unsettling to think of it happening so close to home. Makes one wonder what other secrets might be lurking about the countryside. Peter, his mother said sharply, I hardly think we need to encourage such speculation. Battle filed away this small family dynamic while continuing his gentle questioning about the history of Orchard House. He learned that Tobias Montford had been Colonel Montford's uncle, a man described with careful neutrality as rather eccentric and not entirely suited to country life. The house had been abandoned after his disappearance in 1898, and the family had made several attempts to sell or lease it over the years without success. The villagers considered it unlucky, Colonel Montford explained. My uncle's disappearance was never satisfactorily explained, and there were various rumors, most of them nonsense, of course, but they affected the property's reputation. What sort of rumors? Oh, the usual country gossip, stories about strange lights in the windows, peculiar visitors, and that sort of thing. My uncle was not particularly sociable, and people tend to invent explanations for what they don't understand. The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of an elderly woman who moved with the careful deliberation of advanced age, but whose eyes remained sharp and alert. Miss Agatha Montford, Battle realized, observing the way the younger family members deferred to her presence. Agatha, Colonel Montford said, rising to assist her to a chair. These gentlemen are from Scotland Yard. They're investigating the discovery at Uncle Tobias's house. The effect of this announcement on Miss Agatha Montford was immediate and unmistakable. Her face, which had been merely cautious, became deeply troubled, and Battle observed the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the arms of her chair. I see, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And what exactly have they found? Battle described the discovery in general terms, watching carefully as he spoke. Miss Agatha's distress seemed to deepen with each detail, and by the time he mentioned the wedding dress, she had grown quite pale. Aunt Agatha, Rosalind said with concern, are you quite well? Shall I ring for some tea? No, that won't be necessary. Miss Agatha straightened herself with visible effort. It's simply rather shocking, you understand. To think that someone has been lying there all these years and we never knew. Did you know your brother well, Miss Montford? Battle asked gently. Tobias was my younger brother, yes. We were not particularly close in his later years. He had become rather difficult, you understand. Moody and secretive, the family was relieved when he chose to live apart from the main house. Battle noted the careful phrasing and the glances exchanged between the other family members. There were clearly aspects of Tobias Montford's story that were not being fully shared, but he had learned long ago that patience often yielded more information than direct questioning. The interview continued for another quarter-hour, with Battle gathering basic facts about family history and the timeline of events surrounding Tobias Montford's disappearance. When they finally took their leave, he carried with him a collection of impressions that would require careful consideration. Miss Agatha's obvious distress, Mrs. Vivian's defensive coolness, Rosalind's curious engagement, and the undercurrent of tension that seemed to run beneath the family's carefully maintained composure. As they walked back down the drive toward the village, Inspector Leach consulted his notes with satisfaction. Useful visit, I'd say. The old lady knows more than she's telling, that's certain. Battle nodded thoughtfully, but his attention was caught by movement at one of the manor's upper windows. Someone was watching their departure with considerable interest, though the figure stepped back before he could identify them clearly. The Montford family, he reflected, presented all the hallmarks of a household, with secrets carefully maintained across generations. The challenge would be determining which of those secrets were connected to the skeleton in the wedding dress and which family member was most determined to keep them buried. Chapter 4. echoes from the past. The fragment of paper that had been caught between the skeleton's ribs proved more revealing than Battle had initially hoped. Under the careful examination of Dr. Henley's magnifying glass, the yellowed scrap yielded up its secrets in faded ink that spoke of careful feminine handwriting and urgent emotion. I cannot bear to think of what Papa will say when he discovers the truth about R.M. and myself, but the ceremony was beautiful, and June has always been my favorite month for. Battle studied the fragment with the methodical attention he brought to all evidence, noting the quality of the paper and the educated script. The initials R.M. appeared twice in the recovered text, along with references to marriage and family disapproval that suggested a clandestine union. Interesting choice of hiding place, Inspector Leach observed, settling into the chair opposite Battle's desk at the Red Lion. Almost as if someone wanted the diary to be found eventually. Or, Battle replied thoughtfully, someone was interrupted while attempting to destroy it completely. Their morning's work had taken them to the village church, where the parish records revealed the first significant discrepancy in the official Montford family history. Father Morrison, the elderly rector who had served Greyminster for nearly 40 years, had unlocked the registry with the careful reverence of a man who understood the weight of recorded history. The entries for June 1898 showed 3 marriages performed during that month, but only one involved a member of the Montford family. On June 15, 1898, Tobias Edmund Montford had married Rose Elizabeth Millicent, with witnesses listed as James Hartwell and Mary Carmichael, names that Battle recognized as belonging to village families still represented in Greyminster 30 years later. I remember hearing stories about that wedding, Father Morrison had said, adjusting his spectacles to peer more closely at the entry. My predecessor, Father Benedict, performed the ceremony. It was apparently a rather sudden affair, no banns posted, just a special license. The sort of thing that causes talk in a village this size. Battle had questioned the rector gently about what he might have heard regarding the circumstances, but Father Morrison's knowledge came entirely from second-hand accounts passed down through parish gossip. Still, the pattern that emerged was suggestive: a hurried marriage, family opposition, and the bride's subsequent disappearance from village life within weeks of the ceremony. The afternoon brought them back to Montford Manor, where Battle's patient persistence finally overcame Miss Agatha Montford's reluctance to discuss family documents. The elderly woman received them in her private sitting room, a comfortable space filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life lived in one place. "I suppose you must see them," she said, her voice carrying the resignation of someone who had exhausted her capacity for resistance, "though I cannot imagine what purpose it will serve to rake over these old troubles." The family Bible yielded the first concrete evidence of deliberate concealment. The marriage of Tobias Montford was recorded in a shaky hand that differed markedly from the neat script used for other family events. More tellingly, the entry had been partially erased and written over, as though someone had attempted to alter the record after the fact. The original entry showed the bride's name as Rose Elizabeth Millicent, Miss Agatha admitted when Battle pointed out the discrepancies. But later, after the troubles began, someone thought it best to obscure certain details. "What sort of troubles, Miss Agatha?" The old woman's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages of the Bible. Tobias was never quite the same after his marriage. He became morose, suspicious of everyone. He claimed that Rose had been taken from him, that someone in the family was responsible for her disappearance. Quite impossible, of course. We barely knew the girl. Battle noted the careful phrasing and the way Miss Agatha's eyes avoided direct contact while she spoke. "You say Rose disappeared?" When exactly? It must have been late June or early July of 1898. One day she was there, living at Orchard House with Tobias, and the next she was simply gone. Tobias claimed she had gone to visit relatives, but he could never say where or provide any means of contacting her. The family documents revealed a complex web of inheritance and property ownership that had shifted significantly following Rose Millicent's disappearance and Tobias Montford's subsequent mental decline. Battle traced the progression carefully, noting how the ownership of Orchard House and its grounds had reverted to the main family estate when Tobias was declared legally incompetent in 1899. "Who made the decision to have your brother declared incompetent?" Battle asked. "The family solicitor recommended it, in consultation with Dr. Patterson. He was the physician here before Dr. Henley's time. Tobias had become quite impossible to manage. He would wander the grounds at all hours, searching for Rose and making wild accusations about what had become of her." Miss Agatha's account was supplemented by Battle's careful questioning of the village's older residents, conducted with the patient thoroughness that characterized his approach to historical investigations. Mrs. Carmichael, now in her 70s and the postmistress's mother, had been a witness at the wedding, and remembered the event with surprising clarity. "Pretty little thing Rose was," she told Battle, as they sat in her cottage parlor, surrounded by 3 generations of family photographs. "Not from our village, mind you. Came from over Cheltenham way, I believe. Met young Mr. Tobias at some social gathering or other. Love at first sight, you might say, though the family weren't pleased about it." "Why weren't they pleased?" "Well, she wasn't quite their class, was she? Nice enough girl, well-spoken and all, but her father was in trade. Made his money in manufacturing, I heard. The Montfords had always married within the county families, if you understand my meaning." Mrs. Carmichael's memories painted a picture of a young woman caught between social worlds, acceptable enough to win Tobias Montford's affection, but not sufficiently connected to gain his family's approval. The hasty marriage suggested desperation on both sides, and Rose's subsequent isolation at Orchard House had apparently deepened, rather than resolved, the family tensions. "She came to the post office once or twice in those first weeks," Mrs. Carmichael recalled. "Seemed nervous, always looking over her shoulder, as though she expected someone to follow her. Asked about posting letters to Cheltenham, but I never saw her actually send any." The pattern that emerged from these conversations was both poignant and suggestive. Rose Millicent had married into a family that never accepted her, lived in increasing isolation with a husband who grew progressively more unstable, and finally vanished completely under circumstances that no one had thought to investigate thoroughly at the time. Battle's evening found him in his room at the Red Lion, organizing his notes and constructing the timeline that was beginning to emerge from his patient accumulation of facts. The secret marriage in June 1898, Rose's disappearance within weeks, Tobias's mental deterioration, and his eventual disappearance the following year formed a sequence that suggested tragedy rather than simple misfortune. The diary fragment provided the emotional context for these bare facts, revealing a young woman's hopes and fears about her clandestine marriage and its likely reception by both families. But the fragment's location within the skeleton's ribcage suggested something more sinister than disappointment or family rejection. From his window, Battle could see the lights of Montford Manor glowing in the distance across the fields. Somewhere within those walls, he was increasingly certain, lay the knowledge that would explain not only Rose Millicent's fate, but the carefully maintained family silences that had preserved their secrets for 3 decades. Chapter 5. Buried Secrets. Dr. Henley's surgery occupied the ground floor of his comfortable house facing the village green, and it was there that Battle found himself on a grey Thursday morning, studying the careful documentation of a 30-year-old death. The skeleton had been laid out on the examination table with scientific precision, each bone cleaned and positioned according to anatomical correctness. "The fracture is quite clear once you know where to look," Dr. Henley said, indicating the temporal bone with his pencil. "A single blow, delivered with considerable force to the left side of the skull. The angle suggests the victim was struck from above and behind, not the sort of injury one sustains in an accidental fall." Battle examined the bone fragment carefully, noting the clean edges of the break and the radiating crack lines that spoke of sudden, violent impact. What sort of weapon would produce such an injury? Something heavy and blunt. A poker, perhaps, or a walking stick with a weighted head. The damage is consistent with a single blow rather than repeated strikes, which suggests either great force or considerable precision on the part of the attacker. The revelation transformed Battle's understanding of the case from mysterious disappearance to deliberate murder. Rose Millicent had not simply vanished from her unhappy marriage, she had been killed and carefully buried in a manner designed to conceal the crime. The wedding dress, which had initially struck Battle as poignant, now seemed macabre in its suggestion of interrupted hopes. How long after death would burial have taken place? Battle asked. Dr. Henley considered the question with the thoroughness that marked his professional approach. "Given the preservation of the clothing and the position of the skeleton, I would estimate burial occurred within hours rather than days. Someone took considerable care to ensure proper positioning. This was not a hasty concealment." Battle spent the remainder of the morning reviewing the local stories that Mrs. Carmichael and other village residents had shared about the period following Rose's disappearance. Several mentioned Tobias Montford's increasingly erratic behavior, including his habit of searching the grounds around Orchard House and his repeated claims that Rose had been taken from him. But one detail in particular had captured Battle's attention. Multiple witnesses recalled Tobias's obsession with the orchard behind the house. He would spend hours out there, old James Hartwell had told Battle the previous evening, walking between the trees, digging with his hands, calling her name. Poor devil seemed convinced she was somewhere on the property, though the family insisted she'd gone back to her people in Cheltenham. The pattern suggested that Tobias Montford had known more about his wife's fate than he had been able to articulate coherently. His mental deterioration, which the family had attributed to grief and disappointment, might instead have been the result of witnessing or discovering Rose's murder. Battle returned to the excavation site with a team of workers borrowed from the county police, armed with systematic instructions for searching the orchard area. Inspector Leach supervised the grid pattern search, while Battle observed from a position that allowed him to watch both the work and the approaches to the site. He noted with interest that several members of the Montford family had found reasons to pass by during the morning, each pausing to observe the renewed activity with carefully controlled expressions. The second discovery came just before noon, when one of the constables called attention to an area beneath the largest of the remaining apple trees. The soil here showed the same artificial settling that had marked the cellar burial site, and careful excavation soon revealed the outline of another grave. This skeleton was in a markedly different condition from the first. Where Rose's burial had been careful and deliberate, this grave showed signs of hasty concealment. The bones lay in a twisted position that suggested the body had been placed quickly and without ceremony, and the remains of clothing indicated male attire of good quality but in disarray. More significantly, the skeleton was accompanied by personal effects that had survived the decades underground. A pocket watch, badly tarnished but still bearing an engraved inscription, provided the first concrete identification: TEM, 21st birthday, 1875. Battle calculated quickly. Tobias Edmund Montford would have been 44 years old in 1898, matching Dr. Henley's preliminary assessment of the skeleton's age. Another skull fracture, Dr. Henley confirmed after his initial examination. Similar weapon, similar angle of attack. Both victims were struck from behind, suggesting they were taken by surprise or killed by someone they trusted enough to turn their backs on. The implications of this second discovery required careful consideration. Battle retreated to his room at the Red Lion to organize his thoughts and consult the family documents Miss Agatha had reluctantly provided. The inheritance records revealed a complex pattern that had been obscured by the passage of time and careful legal management. Prior to his marriage, Tobias Montfort had inherited Orchard House and its grounds from his grandfather, making the property independent of the main Montfort estate. This inheritance had been set up to pass to Tobias's children, or failing that to revert to his eldest brother, Colonel Edmund's father, Henry Montfort. The legal records showed that Tobias had been declared dead in absentia in 1902, 4 years after his disappearance. This declaration had allowed the property to pass to Henry Montfort, who had subsequently incorporated it into the main estate. The financial benefit to the family had been substantial. Orchard House commanded excellent agricultural land, and its sale or development rights had provided the capital for several improvements to Montfort Manor during the early 1900s. Battle traced the chain of ownership through to the present day, noting how the current Colonel Montfort's comfortable circumstances rested substantially on property that had become available through his uncle's convenient disappearance. The pattern suggested motive as well as opportunity. Someone in the Montfort family had gained significantly from the deaths of both Tobias and Rose. The timing of the murders also supported this theory. Rose's death in late June 1898 would have eliminated any claim she might have had as Tobias's widow, while Tobias's subsequent murder had cleared the way for the property to revert to his brother. The careful burial of Rose contrasted with the hasty concealment of Tobias, suggesting the murders had been planned with different degrees of preparation. Battle's investigation into the family's circumstances during 1898 revealed additional suggestive details. Henry Montfort had been experiencing financial difficulties related to unsuccessful investments in South African mining ventures. The income from Orchard House would have provided exactly the sort of relief his situation required, transforming potential ruin into continued prosperity. As evening approached, Battle found himself contemplating the view from his window toward Montfort Manor. The discovery of Tobias's remains had completed a picture that was both tragic and calculating. Two young people, recently married and planning their future together, had been murdered for financial gain and buried separately to minimize the chance of discovery. The current generation of Montforts was living with the fruits of these crimes, whether they knew the full truth or not. Battle's task was now to determine which family members possessed knowledge of the murders and which among them was prepared to commit further crimes to protect the family's reputation and fortune. The skeleton in the wedding dress had revealed her secrets, but Battle suspected the most dangerous revelation still lay ahead. Someone in Greyminster was prepared to kill to keep the past buried, and that someone was almost certainly watching his investigation with growing desperation. Chapter 6. Present Danger. Battle had always been a light sleeper, a quality that had served him well throughout his career. When the soft creak of floorboards in the corridor outside his room at the Red Lion woke him just after 2 o'clock on Friday morning, he lay perfectly still and listened with the practiced attention of a man accustomed to distinguishing between innocent sounds and those that warranted investigation. The footsteps paused outside his door, and Battle heard the almost inaudible sound of someone testing the door handle. When it failed to turn, Battle had developed the habit of locking his door. Even in apparently safe circumstances, there followed a period of silence that suggested careful consideration of alternatives. The sound that came next was more troubling. The delicate scraping of metal against metal that indicated someone attempting to manipulate the lock. Battle eased himself silently from his bed and positioned himself where he could observe the door while remaining concealed in the room's shadows. His service revolver lay within easy reach, though he hoped the situation would not require its use. The lock yielded after several minutes of patient work, and the door opened just wide enough to admit a slim figure dressed in dark clothing. Battle waited until the intruder had moved well into the room before making his presence known. "Looking for something in particular?" he asked mildly. The figure froze, then spun toward the window in what appeared to be an attempt at escape. Battle moved smoothly to block this route, his bulk filling the narrow space between bed and wall. "I think not," he said, his tone conversational, despite the circumstances. "Suppose we have a civilized discussion instead." The intruder proved to be younger than Battle had expected, barely more than a boy with the nervous energy of someone unaccustomed to criminal enterprise. When Battle lit the bedside lamp, the youth's face revealed a mixture of desperation and fear that suggested amateur rather than professional motivation. "I wasn't taking nothing," the boy said, his voice shaking. "Just looking like." "Looking for what, exactly?" Battle indicated the chair by the window, and after a moment's hesitation, the intruder sat down with the defeated air of someone who recognized the futility of further resistance. The story that emerged was both simple and revealing. The boy, who identified himself as Tommy Wilkins, nephew to the village constable, had been paid £5 to search Battle's room and report on any documents or notes that might concern the Montford family. The payment had come from someone who had approached him after dark the previous evening, someone whose identity he claimed not to know. "Spoke like a gentleman, though," Tommy admitted when pressed for details. "Well-dressed, knew my name and circumstances, said it was just to protect the family from unnecessary embarrassment, nothing criminal about it." Battle questioned the boy gently but thoroughly, extracting a description that could have fitted any of several village residents, but seemed to point towards someone with intimate knowledge of local people and circumstances. The £5 represented more money than Tommy Wilkins was likely to see in several months of ordinary employment, suggesting the anonymous benefactor possessed both means and strong motivation. After ensuring the boy understood the serious legal consequences of his actions and securing his promise to report any further approaches, Battle released him with a warning. But the incident had clarified several important aspects of his investigation. Someone was monitoring his progress closely enough to know when intervention might be necessary, and that someone had sufficient resources to hire accomplices while maintaining personal anonymity. The following day brought confirmation that his investigation was indeed causing anxiety in certain quarters. Battle's careful review of his notes revealed that while nothing had been taken, his papers had been examined with some thoroughness. Someone had been looking for specific information, though the precise nature of their interest remained unclear. His morning visit to Montford Manor provided additional insights into the family's current state of mind. Battle had requested a second examination of the family documents, ostensibly to clarify certain dates and relationships. Miss Agatha Montford received this request with obvious reluctance, but her nephew's presence seemed to steady her resolve. "I suppose we must cooperate fully with your investigation," Colonel Montford said, though his tone suggested this cooperation came at considerable personal cost. "Though I confess I fail to see what bearing 30-year-old family papers could have on your current inquiry." Battle's patient examination of the documents yielded new details about the inheritance arrangements and family finances during the critical period. But more revealing were the family members' reactions as he worked. Miss Agatha remained visibly agitated throughout his visit, starting at unexpected sounds and watching the door as though expecting unwelcome visitors. Mrs. Vivian Montford maintained her cool composure, but betrayed her nervousness through small gestures, the way she twisted her wedding ring, and the frequency with which she glanced toward her husband. Rosalind Montford proved the most interesting to observe. Unlike the others, she seemed genuinely curious about Battle's methods and findings, asking intelligent questions about the investigation process and showing what appeared to be authentic concern for the historical victims. Yet Battle detected something calculated in her manner, as though her apparent openness served to conceal rather than reveal her true thoughts. Peter Montford remained largely silent during the interview, but Battle noted the young man's tendency to defer to his sister's lead in conversation and his apparent discomfort when the discussion touched on family financial arrangements. The dynamic suggested that while Peter might possess knowledge relevant to the case, he was unlikely to act independently of stronger personalities within the family. The afternoon brought news of a more serious attempt at interference. Inspector Leach arrived at the Red Lion with word that someone had attempted to break into the Montford family's solicitors' offices during the previous night. The break-in had been interrupted by a passing constable, but not before several filing cabinets had been ransacked and a quantity of papers scattered. "Curious thing," Leach reported. "The safe wasn't touched, nor the petty cash drawer. Whoever it was seemed interested only in the files relating to family legal matters. The solicitor is quite shaken, says nothing like this has happened in 40 years of practice." Battle considered this development with growing certainty that his investigation had struck close to dangerous ground. Someone was prepared to take considerable risks to prevent certain information from coming to light, and that someone possessed detailed knowledge of where such information might be stored. His evening walk through the village provided the final piece of evidence he needed. Battle had developed the habit of taking a constitutional after dinner, ostensibly for the exercise, but actually to observe the patterns of village life when residents believed themselves unobserved. As he passed the church, he noticed a figure moving furtively among the headstones with what appeared to be a small electric torch. Battle positioned himself in the shadow of the lych gate and waited with the patience that had characterized his entire career. Within minutes, he was rewarded by the sight of someone emerging from the graveyard and walking quickly toward the manor house. The figure's gait and bearing were unmistakable, and Battle finally understood which member of the Montford family was prepared to commit crimes to protect the family's reputation. The knowledge brought with it both satisfaction and concern. Battle now knew his adversary's identity, but he also recognized that a cornered criminal posed far greater danger than one who believed their secret remained safe. Chapter 7. The Weight of Truth. Saturday morning found the Montford family assembled in their drawing-room under circumstances none of them had anticipated when Battle first arrived in Greyminster. The superintendent had requested their presence for what he termed a final review of the facts, and something in his manner had discouraged any attempt at refusal. Inspector Leach sat quietly by the window, his notebook ready, but his attention focused on observing rather than recording. Battle positioned himself near the fireplace, where he could observe each family member clearly. Miss Agatha occupied her usual chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and her face bearing the resignation of someone who had exhausted her capacity for resistance. Colonel Montford sat stiffly upright, his military bearing intact despite the obvious strain of recent days. Mrs. Vivian maintained her customary composure, though Battle noted the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her skirts. Rosalind and Peter sat together on the sofa, their physical proximity suggesting mutual support in the face of unwelcome revelations. "I believe we now understand what happened to Tobias Montford and his wife Rose in the summer of 1898, Battle began, his tone conversational despite the gravity of his words. The facts, when assembled properly, tell a straightforward story of love, greed, and murder. He outlined the sequence of events with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to all cases. Tobias's secret marriage to Rose Millicent had represented more than a romantic gesture. It had created a legal claim to the inheritance that would otherwise revert to his brother. Rose's status as Tobias's legitimate widow would have complicated any attempt to transfer the property following his death. The solution was as practical as it was ruthless, Battle continued. Remove both obstacles to the inheritance with a single plan. Rose was killed first, struck down in the cellar of Orchard House, and buried there in her wedding dress, perhaps as a mockery of her hopes, perhaps as a gesture of remorse. Her careful burial suggests someone who knew her personally. Miss Agatha made a small sound that might have been a sob, but Battle continued without pause. Tobias was killed afterward, probably when he discovered his wife's body or began asking too many questions about her disappearance. His burial was much hastier, suggesting the murderer was working under pressure or had lost the stomach for elaborate concealment. "This is all very dramatic," Mrs. Vivian said, her voice cool despite the circumstances. "But surely you cannot expect us to accept such accusations based on 30-year-old bones and speculation." Battle turned his steady gaze upon her. "The evidence is rather more substantial than that, Mrs. Montfort. The inheritance records show clearly who benefited from these deaths. Henry Montfort, Colonel Montfort's father, was in serious financial difficulty in 1898. The reversion of Orchard House and its grounds provided exactly the relief his circumstances required." Colonel Montfort shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "My father was an honorable man, Superintendent. I cannot permit you to suggest otherwise without concrete proof." "I am not suggesting anything about your father's character," Battle replied mildly. "I am stating facts about his financial situation and the convenient timing of his brother's disappearance. But the murders themselves were committed by someone else, someone who had access to both Orchard House and knowledge of family legal arrangements." The room had grown very quiet, and Battle could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. He had learned long ago that the most effective revelations came not from dramatic accusations, but from patient accumulation of undeniable facts. "The current interference with my investigation has been instructive," he continued. "Someone with intimate knowledge of village life has been attempting to prevent certain discoveries. Someone who knew exactly which documents might prove dangerous and where they were likely to be found." Rosalind Montfort had grown very pale, and Battle noticed the way her brother had instinctively moved closer to her on the sofa. "The person responsible for these recent crimes has been protecting a family secret for many years, living with knowledge that was passed down through the generations like a family curse." "Stop," Rosalind said quietly, the word carrying such weight that everyone in the room turned toward her. "Please stop." Battle waited with the patience that had defined his entire career, watching as the young woman struggled with emotions that had clearly been suppressed for far too long. "You're quite right about the inheritance," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And about someone in the family knowing the truth. But you're wrong about who committed the murders." Miss Agatha made a sharp sound of protest, but Rosalind continued with the determined air of someone who had finally decided to speak after years of silence. "My great-aunt Agnes, Miss Agatha's sister, confessed to the murders on her deathbed in 1920. I was 16 years old, helping to nurse her through her final illness. When she told me what had really happened, she said she couldn't bear to take such a secret to her grave without someone knowing the truth." The revelation hung in the air like smoke, and Battle found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the family dynamics. Agnes Montfort had been Henry's sister, not his wife, a spinster, who had lived quietly at the manor house and died of influenza in the epidemic that followed the war. Agnes killed them both, Rosalind continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She was terrified that Rose's marriage to Tobias would destroy the family's social position and financial security. She struck Rose down in a moment of panic when confronted with demands about inheritance rights, then killed Tobias when he threatened to expose her. The inheritance was never the primary motive. It was fear of scandal and social ruin. Miss Agatha was weeping quietly now, her composure finally cracking under the weight of secrets she had carried for decades. "Agnes made me promise never to tell," she whispered. She said the family had suffered enough, that nothing would be gained by revealing the truth after so many years. Battle understood now why the recent interference had seemed both desperate and amateurish. Rosalind had been trying to protect not just the family's reputation, but the memory of Great-Aunt Agnes, whose moment of panic had destroyed 2 lives and poisoned the family's peace for 30 years. "You've been living with this knowledge since you were 16, Battle observed, his tone gentle. "Carrying the burden of someone else's crimes and trying to protect your family from the consequences. I thought if I could just prevent you from finding certain documents, or delay the investigation long enough, perhaps the truth could stay buried. But I realize now that was impossible." Rosalind looked directly at Battle for the first time. "Some secrets are too heavy to carry forever." The confession brought with it a sense of relief that seemed to fill the room like fresh air after a long confinement. Battle spent another hour gathering the remaining details and ensuring that all aspects of both the historical murders and the contemporary interference attempts were clearly understood. As the family began to disperse, each lost in private contemplation of revelations that would reshape their understanding of their own history, Battle reflected on the human capacity for both evil and sacrifice. Agnes Montford had committed murder in a moment of fear, but her great-niece had spent 12 years of her life protecting the family from the consequences of that moment. The weight of truth, Battle thought, was often heaviest not on those who created it, but on those who inherited it. Epilogue. Justice served. The morning train from Greyminster carried fewer passengers than usual on the Tuesday, following Rosalind Montford's confession. Battle observed this detail with the same methodical attention he had brought to every aspect of the case, noting how news of the investigation's conclusion had already begun to alter the village's normal rhythms. Word travelled quickly in small communities, and the resolution of a 30-year-old mystery would provide conversation for many months to come. Inspector Leach settled into the seat opposite Battle with the satisfied air of a man who had witnessed justice properly administered. The younger officer had handled the procedural aspects of the case with competence, ensuring that all necessary statements were recorded and that the various attempts at interference were documented according to regulation. "Curious how these old cases work themselves out," Leach observed, consulting his notes one final time before closing his notebook. "You'd think after 30 years the truth would stay buried permanently." "Truth has a way of surfacing," Battle replied, watching the Gloucestershire countryside roll past the carriage windows, "especially when it involves murder. Secrets like that poison everything they touch, generation after generation." The formal resolution of the case had required 2 additional days in Greyminster, during which Battle had overseen the proper documentation of Agnes Montford's posthumous confession and the careful cataloguing of evidence that would close the files on both Tobias and Rose's deaths. The local authorities had been efficient and cooperative, though Battle sensed their relief at having the matter resolved without further scandal. Rosalind Montfort would face charges for her interference with a police investigation, but Battle expected the court would view her actions with considerable sympathy given the circumstances. She had committed no violence and had ultimately cooperated fully once the truth became unavoidable. The magistrate would likely impose a fine and perhaps a period of probation, allowing her to continue caring for Miss Agatha, whose health had declined markedly following the revelation. The Montfort family's future remained uncertain. Colonel Edmund faced no criminal charges, but the knowledge that his comfortable circumstances derived from his great-aunt's murders would undoubtedly affect his standing in the community. More practically, the family would need to address questions about their ownership of properties acquired through criminal acts, though the passage of time complicated any simple resolution. "What strikes me most," Leach continued, "is how Miss Rosalind carried that burden for so many years. 16 years old when she learned the truth, and she never told a soul until yesterday." Battle nodded thoughtfully. "Fear makes people do remarkable things, both terrible and noble. Agnes Montfort killed 2 people because she was terrified of scandal and financial ruin. Her great-niece spent 12 years of her life protecting the family from the consequences of that fear." The train's whistle echoed across the fields as they approached a level crossing, and Battle found himself thinking about the strange arithmetic of guilt and innocence that the case had revealed. Agnes Montfort had committed double murder in moments of panic, but she had also lived with the knowledge of her crimes for 22 years before death finally released her from the burden. Rosalind had inherited that burden as a teenager and carried it into adulthood, shaping her entire life around the necessity of protecting her family's secret. "Do you think she always intended to confess eventually?" Leach asked. "I believe she hoped she would never have to," Battle said. "But when faced with the certainty that the truth would emerge anyway, she chose to speak rather than let the investigation reach its own conclusions. There's honor in that choice, even if it came rather late." The village of Greyminster had received the news of the investigation's conclusion with the mixture of fascination and discomfort that such revelations typically provoked. Mrs. Carmichael had been instrumental in ensuring that accurate information reached every household before speculation could take root, though Battle suspected the story would grow in the telling over the years to come. Rose Millicent, the young woman who had married into the Montfort family in hope and died in terror, would finally receive a proper burial in the churchyard where she should have rested 30 years earlier. Dr. Henley had arranged for both skeletons to be interred together in a ceremony that acknowledged their tragic connection while respecting the community's need for closure. Father Morrison had spoken movingly about forgiveness and the heavy price of secrets, though Battle noted that several prominent families had chosen not to attend the service. The legal proceedings arising from the case would continue for some time, but Battle's role was essentially complete. He had identified the perpetrator of the 1898 murders, documented the evidence of their crimes, and resolved the contemporary attempts to conceal that evidence. Justice, in its imperfect human form, had been served according to the constraints imposed by time and mortality. "Makes you wonder how many other families are carrying similar secrets," Leach mused, as the train began its approach to the London suburbs. "Most secrets are smaller than murder," Battle replied. "But you're right that every family has things they prefer not to discuss. The difference is whether those secrets require active concealment or simply polite silence." The train pulled into Paddington Station with the punctuality that marked efficient railway service, and Battle gathered his belongings with the methodical care that characterized all his actions. The case files would require proper organization back at Scotland Yard, and there would be reports to complete and supervisors to brief. But the essential work, the patient observation and careful deduction that solved crimes, was finished. As they walked through the station's bustling concourse, Battle reflected on the human capacity for both evil and redemption that the case had demonstrated. Agnes Montfort had committed terrible crimes, but her confession to Rosalind suggested a conscience that had never entirely accepted what she had done. Rosalind herself had chosen protection over justice for 12 years, but had ultimately found the courage to speak the truth when circumstances demanded it. The afternoon edition to the London papers would carry brief mentions of the case's resolution, though the details would be sparse and the language carefully circumspect. The full story would remain largely within Greyminster, where it belonged, adding another chapter to the long history of a village that had seen birth, death, love, and loss across countless generations. Battle returned to his desk at Scotland Yard with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had completed his work properly and thoroughly. The case of the skeleton in the wedding dress was closed, but the questions it had raised about family loyalty, moral courage, and the weight of inherited guilt would linger in his mind for many years to come.